Morning, grade nines, and welcome to your Renaissance theory lesson. Um, Again, apologies for no face cam, but let's not subject ourselves to that horror today. Instead, let's focus on the Renaissance, which I hope that you have heard of at some point. So we have our intro with one of these fun fonts. Its name is Blackadder. And let's begin, assuming that the button works. There we go. Okay, so the Renaissance happened in between the year 1300 and the year 1800. So that is a fair amount of time for a whole lot of stuff to happen. Um, and there's huge developments that happened in those 500 years, which we will look at. So there's different versions of the Renaissance. There's the early Renaissance and late Renaissance, but we're just going to focus on the Renaissance in general. The Renaissance that we are focusing, as in Renaissance with a capital R, happened in Europe, specifically Italy. And there were different moments and different things that happened in Italy at different times, which I will get to later. So, the subject matter, how do we identify a Renaissance artwork? So, they are mostly identified by Christian or biblical images. So, if you see a scene from the Bible, like Genesis or the creation of Adam, which we'll look at later, Mary and Jesus in the manger. You can tell that I don't know my Bible, but any scene from the Bible or any Christian imagery will identify a Renaissance artwork. But we also see important people being painted. The reason for that is that at this point in time, art was very expensive to make, and only the very rich and the very important could afford to have themselves painted or the people that they loved painted. But at this point in time, the church was really, really big. So churches had a lot of money and they dedicated a lot of time and energy to creating these images. And it was because a lot of people couldn't read, but I'll talk about that in a little bit. So, subject matter, anything Christian or from the Bible or important humans. Our artists are Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Donatello, and Raphael. The way that I remember this is the Ninja Turtles, which might go over your heads, but if you do know the Ninja Turtles, it's Leonardo, Michelangelo, Donatello, and Raphael. And then we also have Botticelli, and he is our outlier and does not form part of the Ninja Turtles because he's one of the few Renaissance artists that didn't paint too much Christian imagery, and the painting that we'll look at by him is actually from the Roman mythology, which is quite interesting. So we've got our Ninja Turtles and then Botticelli, who's our outlier. Okay, reason we care. Why do we care? Why do we study this? So the Renaissance had the greatest amount of artistic development in the shortest period of time. So you think that 500 years um, is a lot of time, but in the context of human history, it's very short. But the way that our technology developed and changed in those 500 years and the way that it affected art was very rapid, especially when you compare sort of the art of the Middle Ages, which came right before this. Um, huge changes. So artistic development, and it also produced some of the most beautiful artworks that have ever existed. And we all know the Mona Lisa. The Mona Lisa is a Renaissance artwork. We'll look at the Sistine Chapel, Renaissance artwork. Um, Most of the artworks we'll look at in this lesson, you should recognize because they are very famous and very beautiful. We also care because there was a huge development in linear perspective. So we know that linear perspective is the distance that can be found within an artwork. So before this point in time, most artworks were quite flat. But when we look at the Mona Lisa, you'll be able to see how distance was incorporated. In This isn't as important, but humanism shifted the focus in philosophy onto the human being. So, what does it mean to have a human experience? You can do some Googling on this for more information, but it's not that important for you to know right now at this point. And then the printing press. So, early in history, earlier in history, sort of the Middle Ages in Europe, most people couldn't read. So how people got their knowledge was through the church or through people who were in power. And you had to be very special or in a specific social class to be able to be educated so that you could read. And most, as I said, most knowledge came from the church. But with the invention of the printing press, I think it was in Germany, fact check me on that, um, knowledge was able to be produced on a large scale. So before this, when books were made, they were handmade by very specifically trained people who could make sure that their handwriting was beautiful and legible. But with the printing press, you could print like hundreds of books a day and then distribute these to people. So with the invention of the printing press, a lot more people became very educated very quickly because they had access to this knowledge. Again, that's not as important, but it does sort of link with the idea that the Renaissance had a huge amount of artistic development in a short amount of time. And this came with the general expansion of knowledge, which I'll talk about more as we go. Okay, so I've used this word Renaissance a lot. What does it mean? So the word Renaissance means rebirth in French. So at this point in history, people were thinking differently about ideas, and um, there was a renewed interest in the classical, the old, and that sort of stuff. So a renaissance also means a revival or a renewed interest in something. In this case, it was a linking back to the old Greek and Roman mythology that formed part of Italy's history. Yeah, so learn this definition, either one of these definitions, it's quite important. Okay, Famiglia de' Medici. So the Medici family in Italy were a super rich banking family, and they were part of the people who formed this change in Italian society that led to the creation of art. So they were patrons of the arts, and a patron is a person who gives financial or any other kind of support to an organization, cause, or human being. So in this case, I'm sure you guys have heard of Patreon. There's a whole bunch of internet creators, and this works the same way, where you pledge a certain amount of money and they are allowed to carry on and make their art without having to worry about paying rent. So the support of the Medici family allowed artists to make cool stuff that they wanted to make. And the Medici family also commissioned various artworks. So a commission is where you pay an artist to make an artwork to your taste in exchange for money. So the way that the art world works now, it works both in terms of buyers buying art that's already made, or saying, hey, I'd like you to make this very specific thing for me. How much are you going to charge me? And that sort of stuff. So I've been commissioned once or twice to make some paintings, and you sort of have to have a very good relationship with that person to keep on checking and be like, are you sure this is what you want? Do you want me to change anything? Is this blue too blue, or whatever? So I've spoken a lot about the Renaissance in Italy, but the rest of the world is not unimportant here. So what some Italian explorers went to do was to discover, in inverted commas, the rest of the world, which was kind of silly because there were already people living in these places. And the Italians went to go and discover Spain and Portugal, which sounds a bit silly because there were already people there. And the Spanish and the Portuguese were not that far behind Italy in what was happening in the Renaissance. But then we look at India, Africa, and America. And as we've spoken about before, we know about colonialism, where countries in Europe went in and took over. So Italy was thinking about doing this, but they didn't end up colonizing the rest of the world like Britain or the Dutch did. So when we look at Renaissance with a capital R, we think of the one in Italy, but other countries and other places had their moments of Renaissance, rebirth, awakening, but these happened at different moments in time, depending on what was happening in that country at that point. So we can talk about Renaissances in the plural. Um, So South Africa has had its Renaissance, but that's a sort of matric level thing to talk about. And while I'm here, I just want to mention that the reason that the mostly male artists had so much time to sort of play around with their art and their creations was because there was a lot of unpaid labor being done by women. So even if the male artists weren't straight, there was still a woman in the space in his house who was cooking for him, cleaning up after him, doing all of that day-to-day stuff that we need to do to survive and exist. But because he didn't have to do that, he had more time to ponder and think and paint and whatever. So there aren't that many women Renaissance artists, and that's because of the gender roles in 1300 to 1800 in Italy at that point. So I just want you to keep in mind that we praise these male artists, but we mustn't forget about the labor of women who that went into this into these artworks. Okay, so we have the Mona Lisa, which I'm sure you guys have heard of. I hope you guys have heard of. It was made by Leonardo da Vinci. It took him 3 years to paint, and it is oil on wood, which is quite unusual for this. No, it wasn't actually this. It wasn't unusual. Most artists painted on wood because it was a lot easier to keep steady and it didn't warp because Italy can be quite humid if you're close to, like, if you're in Venice, for example, close to the water. Anyway, it is not that big. It's smaller than an A3 piece of paper. And if any of you are lucky enough to go to the Louvre and see it, it is hidden behind like a couple of inches of bulletproof, infrared proof, everything proof glass because it is so valuable. And I mentioned earlier this thing about linear perspective. So you can see in the background here, I mean, we've got Da Vinci's visible brush strokes here, but we can see the atmospheric perspective that he's managed to put into this painting. So we've got the Mona Lisa. She's sitting on a veranda, on a stoep or something. And we've got the Italian mountains in the background, and it fades as we go. And the reason that this is so effective is because warm colors come forward and cool colors go back. So he's got this really bright red that's close next to the veranda, and as we go, it gets, this is still quite a bright blue, and then it fades more and more as we go back, and that's what creates that linear perspective. So we can see here that she is rather beautiful, and there's a lot of detail here in this painting, but we can also see that there's a lot of detail that is lost. And the reason for that is a thing called the aging of the glaze. So glazing was something that an artist did where they paint a sort of resin type material over the painting to preserve it, to preserve the oil underneath. And resin is good for that because you can take the resin off without damaging the oil paint. But because this painting is so rare and so valuable, it has not been touched by any art historians or what's the word I'm looking for? Art restorers, anyway, the people who restore paintings. And you can see this image that I've got here. There's some damage here, but the Mona Lisa is a very enigmatic painting. There's a whole lot of mythology in our culture surrounding it. So I hope you guys do some Googling and read about the her smile, for example. Many art historians have studied this painting and written countless papers about it. So if you're keen, let me know and we can talk some more about it, or you can do your own research. But is even the detail in her dress here is really beautiful. And fun fact, um, they did an X-ray of this painting, and in one of the early drafts, because Da Vinci would paint over paintings he didn't like, he didn't start again because art materials were obviously very expensive. And in one of the X-rays, she's holding a rose, I think it is, which is very interesting because of the symbology involved with that. And underneath the ruined glaze, she does in fact have eyebrows. Just for your information, so you know. Cool. So we've got here the creation of man by Michelangelo. It took him a long time to make, and this is a fresco. I'll tell you what a fresco is shortly. It's huge. It's almost 3 meters by almost 6 meters, and it's in the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican City. So what a fresco is that this painting, this artwork is obviously on the ceiling. So what Michelangelo did is that he rigged himself up some scaffolding, like the kind of scaffolding you see outside a building or when like windows are being cleaned, that sort of scaffolding. He made himself some of that and he would lie flat on his back and paint, which was very, very bad for him. And it really ruined his eyesight and his painting arm. But anyway, so a fresco is he would put in bits of plaster and you can see the breaks are in line with the lines of plaster that he would do. So he'd put in the plaster while it was wet and then he would paint into it wet and he would work in sections. And you can see these crack lines sort of hearken to the idea of this working in sections. So we've got this very poignant scene from the Bible. So God has created Adam, and this is the moment here with these hands where God is giving life to Adam. And Michelangelo was known in his paintings for putting muscles in weird places and making his figures overly muscly. And you can see that here in the join of Adam's tricep to his armpit. Like, that's a very weird thing that's happening there. And I'm going to address the elephant in the room, which is this bit of Adam here. And the reason that he is not a very well endowed man is because at this point in history, it was believed that the bigger your bits were, the more barbaric you were. So to have a smaller bits meant that you were more intelligent, which was why that was painted that way. Fact check me if I'm wrong, but it's a very interesting thing to note. But what I really enjoy about Michelangelo is his attention to detail, and this particular moment here of the hands is very, very iconic. Anyway, so we've got Adam, and he's lying on the earth, and then we've got God who's sort of flying around, and he's surrounded by angels and cherubs, and we've got this really weird thing of this red surrounding the angels and God Himself, and I read this as very womb-like. So this is a moment of birth, and birth is typically something that happens as something emerging out from a womb. But you can read into it what you like. So we'll talk more about the Sistine Chapel and your assignment as we go, including more about how Michelangelo made this painting with regards to your ceiling painting. Okay, so here we have another sculpture by Michelangelo. It's called La Pietà, or the Pity. It's in St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican City. I was lucky enough to get to go to Italy a couple of years ago, and I've seen both here the Sistine Chapel and the sculpture up close and in person. I just can't find my own photos to share with you guys, and nobody wants to see that anyway. So the Pity. The Pity is a moment from the Bible where Mary is cradling Jesus after he has been taken down from the cross after his crucifixion. And this is a particularly emotional moment that many artists have tried to replicate over the years. So marble at this point was very expensive, very difficult to get, but Michelangelo really manages to make it look like it's real. I mean, you can see the shine of the reflection, and skin doesn't shine like that. But if you look at the folds of Mary's dress here, it really does look like fabric. And even in the moment here of the thing she's wearing on her head, like those folds look soft, and it's really, really beautiful. But what's also interesting is that the proportions here are distorted. So Jesus at this point was a 30-year-old man. He should have been significantly bigger than his mother. But here she is much, much bigger, and he looks almost childlike in his size, which sort of emphasizes this moment of her loss, when he dies as he's taken down from the cross. So luckily for us, the Pieta is rather straightforward, but I just think the way that Michelangelo approaches this medium of marble is really, really beautiful. Okay, so this is Raphael. This is called the Deposition, and the Deposition is the moment that Jesus comes down from the cross. So I think this lady here is one of the ladies. This might be Mary. Anyway, it's the moment where he comes down from the cross and right before Mary cradles his body. And what's interesting here is how Raphael approaches color. So we can see the linear perspective that I mentioned in the background here. I mean, those mountains really do look like they're in the distance. And we've got a little city there, and then we've got some other crosses where other people were being crucified at that same point in history. So these colors in the background are very, very soft, but it almost looks macabre in its cheerfulness, like this blue sky with these white fluffy clouds. And then this is the moment that Jesus dies. It's quite hectic. So we can look at Jesus, and a lot of people here have halos, which becomes a symbol of divinity and helps us as the viewer to understand who is important. So we can assume that these men here are part of the apostles because of their halos, and then all of these women also have halos, which I can't remember exactly who they are, but they're obviously important. But what's interesting is that this person and this person don't have halos. So they might have been, I think this person is a Roman. So they were obviously not in Jesus's inner circle. So let's have a look at him. I mean, he's got this really ashy skin tone compared to everybody else, and then the beautiful detail of the moments in his hand, and also where he was betrayed and stabbed there. So yeah, this is the Deposition by Raphael. I could talk about this and the little details and the moments and like this hair and this facial expression for ages, but I think that this is um, quite self-explanatory. But Raphael was known for his intense color, like we can see here, and also his detail. I mean, like, if you look at these little plants at the bottom here, it's amazing. Okay, so I've mentioned that Botticelli is a bit of an outlier. So what we've got here is The Birth of Venus by Botticelli. So Venus, or Aphrodite, Venus is her Roman name and Aphrodite is her Greek name, was born out of the sea foam on the one of the Greek islands. I want to say it's Cyprus, but I don't think it is. I'll double check. But she was born out of the sea foam, and she is the goddess of love and all of the corresponding feelings that go along with that. And part of her children include um, gods and goddesses of all the different kinds of love, including friendship love, romantic love, family love, and whatever. So this is tempera on wood panel. So what tempera is a mixing of egg yolk and pigment to create paint. So instead of mixing the pigment with oil or mixing it into the wet plaster like a fresco, that was how that was made. It's very finicky to work with. It creates a lovely sheen to it, but it's very finicky and it's very hard to get right. So it's pretty big, and it's in the Uffizi Gallery in Italy, where you can go and see it. I haven't seen it myself, but it's very beautiful. So we've got Venus here. She's riding these very non-realistic waves from her on her seashell, and she's making her way to the island where she was home. She was at home before she went to Olympus. And then there's a lot of conflicting opinions about this lady and these people. So this lady here is obviously trying to get clothes on Aphrodite as soon as possible. because she is the goddess of beauty and the goddess of lust, and she's obviously having an effect on this being here. But what I want to draw your attention to right now is the difference in body standards. So, in the year of our Lord 2020, our aesthetic role models include people like the Kardashians, um, Doja Cat, Ariana Grande, those sorts of people, and they are typically tanned with very slim, athletic sort of bodies. Their hair is either naturally dark or it's dyed all sorts of crazy colors. I mean, Kylie and her wig collection is renowned. Um, we all know about the body standard, and what I think those people neglect to mention is how much time, effort, and surgery goes into that, including like personal trainers and having a personal chef and that sort of stuff. But in the Renaissance, you were beautiful if you were pale, because the nobility did not have to work in the sun. So the paler your skin was, it meant the wealthier you were, and therefore the more beautiful. And we can see here that Venus, Aphrodite, is not particularly skinny. She's got a little bit of a tummy, and she doesn't have a thigh gap and that sort of stuff. And the reason for that was because if you had a little bit of extra body fat, it meant that you had more than enough to eat, which was also something that was desirable at the time. And we can see here on her tummy um, this little bit of fat here sticks out in women because that's where your uterus pushes out, because it's closer to your skin than your intestines are. So the fact that we can see this in the fact that we can see this in Aphrodite means that she is fertile, and that is something that's desirable. And then, as well, her hair is very red. We could almost call her a ginger, and this is because um, being redheaded or being a ginger was very rare at this point of time in Italy. So it was seen as something that was quite beautiful because it hadn't been seen before. But anyway, we can talk about this. I could talk about this painting for hours, but you can get the general gist of it. And again, Botticelli is our outlier because this is a moment from Greek/Roman mythology that um, was not necessarily from the Bible. Okay, cool. And then we've got Donatello, and this is the Bronze David. You guys all know about the Big David in Italy. He's, I think, 17 foot tall. But this David, the Bronze David, is shorter than I am, from the top of his head to the bottom of his thing that he stands on. So he's relatively small. And what's interesting about this David is his childlike nature, and also how feminine his stance is. So typically at this point in sculpture, the men were presented as very, very masculine, but there are rumors that Donatello liked other men, which is why he depicted this David in that way, because he's got or a sort of more feminized face. I don't want to use the word childlike because he's not. And the feminine sort of slant of his hips here. But the difference in weight in his hips is something that we in art call contrapposto, which means opposing posture. So the shoulders are forming a different line to that of the hips. So the shoulders are going on a diagonal like this, and the hips are going at a diagonal like that. And that is what gives life to this painting, which I think is really beautiful. So we've got this lovely David who's sort of chilling here, and then here's this really gruesome decapitated head of Goliath that he's just sort of casually resting his foot on, which I think is really, really cool. Okay, so the Sistine Chapel and how it relates to your assignment. So the Sistine Chapel was painted by a whole bunch of artists over many, many years, but Michelangelo was commissioned specifically to do the ceiling. So the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, this isn't all of it, mostly depicts Genesis. So I think it's the first chapter in the Bible, And it's the moment where God made everything and there's a whole lot of stuff going on. So we can see here in the middle, we've got the creation of Adam, which is the most famous one. And what Michelangelo did for placeholders is that he put little angels and cherubs as place fillers. And a lot of these angels and cherubs and stuff had the faces of people who were important at the time, like government officials or the nobility or whatever. So what I'm looking for from you guys for your ceiling drawing assignment is I want you to use the template that I've given you, which is the 3 rectangles, and I want you to tell me a story in 3 drawings. So if you like, it can be something biblical, or it can be another moment from another kind of mythology. I mean, the Norse mythology is filled with really beautiful imagery, like the tree of life and Odin, One Eye. We've got Greek mythology. My personal favorite myths include the myth of Persephone and Icarus. So I think that would be something really cool to try and depict. But the story could also be something modern if you would prefer that. So the general gist is that I want you to tell me a story in 3 drawings. And if you want to decorate it, like put in these borders and put decorations in the borders, please feel free. For bonus marks as well, if you sticky tape your piece of paper to the bottom of a table or the bottom of a chair and draw like that, um, I'll give a bonus mark for that. But the problem with painting that way is that it's very, very hard on your body because you're lying flat on your back and straining your eyes, and also your drawing hand doesn't have a fun time because it really restricts the mobility in your shoulder, which is where we need to draw from. Like we need to, excuse me, draw with our whole body and not just our hands and our wrists. But anyway, this is Renaissance in a nutshell. So I hope that this makes sense and that it's something that you can understand. Awkward ending to this lecture. Miss you guys.